Welcome back, world historians. And if you're joining us this week, congratulations, because we're now officially not at hump day, but hump week. This is halfway through History 198, world history to the present. And so today I'm just going to do a quick introduction to Module 3 and say a word about the looming midterm examination. So please remember that this is due by midnight on Tuesday, May the 31st. So literally at the stroke of midnight at the end of this month. There is a little bit of a process to submitting your midterm exams that should be clear if you go through the guidelines. But if you have any questions about the submission process or about any of the terms or questions involved in the midterm exam, obviously I'm not going to tell you what to write, but I can give you some pointers, some clarification, and I'll be happy to do that. Okay, so pressing ahead, our topic this week is something which is referred to here as the dual revolution. That's dual, D-U-A-L, not D-U-E-L, which would involve pistols at dawn. But this is the dual revolution. So there is a dual revolution or twin revolutions going on. We sometimes talk about revolutions as if the French Revolution, the American Revolution, these sort of great political upheavals of the 18th and subsequent centuries are separate events that can be talked about each other in isolation. But really, I think we can talk about this age of dual revolution, these political revolutions being part of a greater shift, a greater transition, particularly in some political ideas like the idea of sovereignty being invested, not in the idea of a sovereign or a monarch, but in popular sovereignty, the American Constitution, for example, beginning "We the people." But we're not just talking here about barricades on the streets in the case of the French Revolution or Declaration of Independence. But the other aspect of this dual revolution, this concept that historians use, Strayer uses, is this idea of the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution, also very important if you think about the fact that we're taking this class online. The fact that everything probably in the room that you're sitting in right now, assuming you're sitting in a room, you could be sitting out on a park bench for all I know. But if you look around yourself, probably everything you're wearing, everything you're interacting with, everything in the built environment around you is the product of mechanical industrial processes. Now, if you go back 300 years before the Industrial Revolution, the exact opposite would be true. Most people actually wore clothes either that were made by themselves or family members, or at least were manufactured by hand rather than by machine. People very often grew their own food. Because of that, they were, of course, also closer to nature, but also likely to die at a much younger age from horrible diseases like typhus, cholera, and so on. So, swings and roundabouts, there are some advantages to the modern world. I'm not sure I would have particularly wanted to have been born before modern medicine. But anyway, I'm getting off track here. So, we're going to be identifying as the goals for this week, identifying the causes of the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution, I'll say a word about that in a second. The American Revolution is, of course, also part of this general movement of the dual revolutions. We can talk about the importance of this conception of liberty, which is born out of the American Revolution. But I think the French Revolution, in many ways, is really the seedbed that spreads these ideas into Europe and through empire and revolution against empire. This then spreads and becomes a global phenomenon. We're also going to be talking, number two, evaluating the impact of the Industrial Revolution during this time period. Incidentally, I should mention that the dates 1750 to 1914 for this module reflect roughly the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So we're talking here roughly about the middle of the 18th century. Obviously, with something like the Industrial Revolution, it's not like people woke up one day and they were, sort of peasants on their farms, and then they woke up and found themselves in a big urban environment working in a factory. It wasn't an overnight event, but roughly in the middle of the 18th century, you start to see very rapid industrialization taking place in Great Britain, especially, also other parts of Western Europe, Germany, for example, places like Belgium in Western Europe, also industrialized very early on, and then quickly caught up by the United States, and only much later by China, by India, and some of these other major Asian powers that we're talking about growing economically today. And then finally, the other goal that we're looking at for this module is continuing to differentiate between ideas of traditional and modern societies. And again, the idea of modernity is very much defined by this idea of the dual revolution. So I mentioned, again, I would say a quick word about why, in many ways, the French Revolution concerns us this week. I'm not saying this detrimentally, but I could argue that the French Revolution in many ways was more radical even than the American Revolution. If you think about our revolution, or perhaps I should say your revolution in 1776, it began as a protest movement against really British colonial policy. We're all familiar with the slogan, a very important slogan, no taxation without representation. So the early American colonists, when they rebelled against the British Empire, they were really not trying to reinvent the wheel, but they were trying to claim rights which they thought, as subjects of a British Empire, they were already entitled to. Now, by contrast, the French revolutionaries began, oddly enough, inspired by the American Revolution. They envisioned similar reforms, in fact, in many ways, quite modest reforms at the beginning. But what they ended up embracing was radical new conceptions of society and politics, which transformed entirely the economic and legal foundations of the nation, challenged notions of slavery. You even start seeing during this period, for example, calls for women to have the vote, early expressions of feminism, and some very radical ideas which was summed up by the French revolutionary motto, liberty, égalité, and equality and fraternity, or brotherhood. So while Mad King George was 3,000 miles away from the British colonies in America, the French had to overthrow their own monarchy, which was much closer to home. And the forces of opposition in France among the aristocracy and the old regime, that's the forces of the aristocracy and the church that combined in support of the king, were actually much stronger than anything the Americans had to overcome. So in France, everything had to be changed if reforms were to be introduced. Therefore, you see the violent convulsions that we'll see in some of the other videos talking about the level of violence in the French Revolution that ended up rippling through the Atlantic world and lighting fires of revolution throughout Europe, throughout Latin America, and even in the slave colony of Haiti that we talked about in last week's class. So this is a very radical movement. Okay, so just very briefly then, we mentioned this idea of the dual revolution. Now, Strayer in his text also talks about the rise of Europe, but he also identifies what he describes as the problem of Eurocentrism. So that's something I want you to think about, perhaps for the discussion boards, as well as the comments on revolution. Think about this problem of Eurocentrism. Now, during the 18th, 19th century, you see a definite rise in the power, the prestige, the influence of industrialized European powers, the British Empire, but also the French, the Germans, and others. And of course, this is a kind of self-amplifying, kind of thing where the Europeans began to believe that because they were developing new technology, that they were colonizing the world, as you see in this illustration here of the world being cut up by the European powers, that somehow there was something inherently, perhaps even racially superior to Europeans. And of course, we don't need to look very far in the history books to know that this is a very dangerous idea. So when we're thinking about the importance of revolution, Strayer again provides this very useful resource at the beginning of part 5 of your textbooks, which is a section that we're looking at with chapters 16 and 17 this week, where he identifies a lot of the individual outbreaks of revolution, some of the major flourishings of liberty, of revolution that are taking place throughout the world. And so if you get confused by some of these geographical terms, it's useful to look back at this map. Also, though, if you look at the western part of this map, if you think about the coincidence of the political revolution, ideas of liberty, of equality, but also the sheer economic power that's unleashed by the Industrial Revolution, which is really very concentrated in the 18th and 19th century in Western Europe, and then to some extent later on, of course, the United States and eventually Japan. But this revolution, industrial, political, also ends up enabling a small handful of world powers to colonize and to go into Asia, go into India, go into Africa, colonize the populations, but also to strip out some of the natural resources, which in turn fuel the engines of power, the engines of empire. And this, of course, is not a new phenomenon. Sorry, I'm stumbling over my words here. But we saw I think this was in chapter 14, the importance to the Spanish Empire of the flow of a single specific commodity, which in this case is actually the international supply of silver. So we think about the conquistadors, Cortez and his ilk, coming from Europe, colonizing America in search of gold. This was certainly true, but what they found, which was more important from an economic point of view, was in fact not gold but silver, because silver becomes the basic kind of commodity of the 17th century, eventually replaced arguably by sugar and other commodities, but really kind of the backbone of the wealth of the Spanish Empire during the 16th and 17th century. During this period, 85% of silver was manufactured in Spanish America alone, in other words, in the Spanish colonies in Latin America. Much of that, incidentally, in this one location in modern-day Bolivia, which is the silver mine at the city of Potosi. And this created a tremendous influx of wealth in Spain. In Europe, also ended up creating inflation. But I think really the biggest impact that it had was in China, because as we'll read about in the textbook, China, during this same period where China is starting to isolate itself from the rest of the world, from the global economy, the Qing dynasty in China is really an illustration of the pitfalls, the dangers perhaps of political isolationism, which is not just to say non-interventionism, but economic isolationism. The Chinese believed that they had everything within their own empire that they needed to survive, to flourish. They didn't want anything else. They didn't want foreign imports at the time that the British and other Europeans were industrializing. But the one thing that the Chinese did do, which was a policy mistake, was they decided that they were going to start collecting all of their currency, all of their tax revenue in silver, which is one thing that they didn't have much of. So because of that, they were forced to import their silver from the Spanish colonies in South America, and eventually the Spanish also gaining a foothold in the Philippines. And this was a doorway for the Europeans to really open up the internal markets in China. And just to finish with, you can see the long-term impact of Chinese economic isolation in terms of regional wealth, share of world manufacturing output during this period, 1750 to 1900. So at the beginning of this period in the 18th century, you're looking at China having almost a third of the world's manufacturing output. It really was one of the great economic powers of the day. And yet by the end of the 19th century, it's really collapsed. And then if you look at the graph at the top as well, you can see the huge kind of isolation, the long-term effects of isolation on the Chinese economy right up until the 1990s. But if you think about China today, yesterday, and tomorrow, you can see that pattern really starting to change. Now we're talking about China entering the modern world once again.